guys, Gigrab here. The idea for the UK leaving the EU has been thrown about for a very long time. However, now we have been presented with the potential to decide this via referendum, which will occur on the 23rd of June this year. Many politicians fight for and against leaving the EU. However, since we don't know what drives them underneath the surface, we shouldn't just go, we shouldn't leave because since David Cameron said so, or we should leave because Nigel Farage or Boris Johnson said so. We need to come to a conclusion ourselves about what's correct to do rationally, with regards to facts rather than political ideology. In these two videos we will analyse the main talking points surrounding both sides of the debate, look into the data and come to a conclusion. This, of course, like anything, will have a healthy amount of my interpretation of information, and I highly suggest, if you can, to find the time to go and read each and every source I provide. In this episode, we will look at the validity of the arguments for leaving the European Union. There are no doubt more reasons, which if demand is high enough, I will address in subsequent videos if people desire. A strong talking point often employed by those who are anti-EU is the amount of immigration and the migrant crisis it has allowed to happen through its free movement of people. This has especially been evident after the Cologne attacks of New Year's Eve, the Paris attacks, and many others things that others such as Sargon of Akkad have addressed thoroughly. While we can view it through the humanitarian view of people such as Corbyn, it is necessary to acknowledge that the migrants from outside the European Union from places such as Syria, Afghanistan, and Libya have a very different view of the world to those in the West. This is generally due to the existing culture and religion in those nations. For instance, while both Christianity and Islam are both exceedingly violent and have parts that are inconsolable with modern thought, it is necessary to mention that the West had the Reformation and resultant Enlightenment, which led to a lot of the liberal and pacifist ideas we have today, whereas the Islamic world had no such equivalent that I am aware of. As a result, a minority of people that are moving into Europe will act in a manner that many perceive as barbaric, and unfortunately the culture post-Second World War has led to governments in the West being reluctant to act in fear of racism. Going into more detail on this topic could be a video of its own right. However, how much does the migrant crisis affect the UK? Mercifully, very little at the moment. The UK has offered to take in 20,000 migrants over the next 5 years, according to the BBC, from the migrant camps only, which will have almost no impact considering that there are 65 million people here. However, based on some negative media portrayals of the decision, David Cameron may cave in and accept more, although it is unlikely to be to the level of Germany. Regardless, the threat of refugees and economic migrants is minimal provided David Cameron and the Conservatives remain in power, it would seem. However, the one place this could go wrong is if Corbyn and Labour become the Prime Minister and government respectively. Corbyn is very pro-migrant and he seems to agree with the idea of an open-door immigration policy, which could potentially have similar results to what we have seen in Europe. We also have to be aware that existing communities of Islamists in the UK are not unable to cause similar events to the Paris attacks, as evidenced by 7/7 and the Rotherham case. To conclude on the migrant crisis, it would seem as if at the moment it is quite unlikely to affect the UK all that much in comparison to somewhere like Germany, although subsequent Prime Ministers could raise hell. The issues that people cite due to Islamic extremism are already in the country regardless of the crisis from prior immigration, so leaving the EU will do virtually nothing. However, the data to do with regular immigration tells a far different story. Of the net migration of 320,000, 45% comes from the EU. This mostly seems to originate from Ireland, Germany and Poland from within the EU, and India and Pakistan from without. Poland is the highest source of immigration to the UK from within the EU, accounting for around 800,000 people, up from around 60,000 in 2001. Although I was unfortunately unable to find data for 2015 on employment of Polish immigrants, The data from 2011 would suggest that Polish immigrants have a very high employment rate of around 80%, although this is in lower skilled jobs. This is obviously a bad thing for British nationals, who apparently have a higher unemployment rate, although this could be down to how the majority of Poles coming to the UK are doing so to work and are able-bodied, whereas general British population will include those who are unable to work. With the migration rates to the UK set to rise, especially from nations such as Romania and Bulgaria, this could pose an even greater threat to employment, especially in lower skilled jobs for working class Britons. Leaving the EU would cut this significantly, and could potentially provide more employment opportunities to the working class, although it could harm businesses as UK nationals will expect better wages than immigrants from the former Soviet bloc countries generally. To conclude on migration, it would seem that leaving the EU would have a significant impact on immigration. Since so much of the immigration comes from within the EU, leaving the EU would allow UK residents better access to generally lower level jobs such as toilet cleaners than if we stayed. But this could impact the business's bottom line due to wages demands, assuming the Britons take the jobs at all. It would also seem unfeasible with current affairs that anything like the New Year's Taharush would occur as a result of unchecked migration as seen within the Schengen area. If it were the case, then it would likely be homegrown. However, this doesn't mean that it won't change if we elect a party with an open door policy. If you were to believe just what the media is saying, you would be inclined to believe this to be a clear-cut issue in favour of us staying inside the EU. However, the reality seems to be a lot less pro-EU. There seems to be a variety of things for us to gain from leaving, many such as free trade agreements with nations outside of the EU being cited by Farage and others. The trouble with this is that it is very dependent on what agreement we have with the EU following referendum. According to this study, it would seem as if the best deal would be a free trade agreement with the European Union, as we can then control somewhat how we trade independently with them. It would also seem to be beneficial if we were to have a Swiss-style agreement instead, wherein there are certain sectors which would have better trade with the EU. This could benefit us quite strongly, considering that some of our largest trading partners are the Netherlands and Ireland, both inside of the European Union. It would also seem that long term we seem to have declining trade with the European Union countries, although significantly spiking somewhat towards the end, so perhaps leaving the EU and having less favourable agreements with them would have a less pronounced effect on us than, say, in the 1990s. However, if an unfavourable agreement is reached post-Brexit, then trade revenues could be seriously impacted, as well as the perception of the UK as the quote-unquote gateway to Europe. This would also have the impact of perhaps driving away corporate HQs from our shores, although this could be somewhat counteracted given how English is the commercial lingua franca at the moment of the world. An unfavourable agreement could also lead to high tariffs, which could make the difference for many between living relatively comfortably and not. Anyway, enough of the negatives. Let's look at some of the positives of us leaving economically. Our government pays $13 billion a year to stay, or 35.6 million a day. This is obviously a lot of money, which could go towards fixing a lot of our internal problems. Leaving would of course give us that money back, which could potentially lead to better public services. We also gain a large amount of control over how we trade. As a nation with a generally liberal view of trade, we would no longer be shackled to more controlled economies in the former Soviet bloc. This would allow us to potentially make more revenue, provided we negotiate better agreements for our bottom line, which would make sense given we make up 1/25 of the world trade according to this chart. This is an absolutely gigantic topic in its own right, and you could honestly make hours and hours of video just on this topic alone. There are tons of reports of hundreds of pages on this alone, and I suggest you go and read them as I have. However, if you cannot find the time, simply put, the economic impact is entirely dependent on the deal we negotiate with the EU and other nations once we leave. I believe, given how much economic grunt we have according to these studies, being second in Europe economically, and speaking the financial lingua franca by default, we definitely have the leverage to argue strong trade agreements after Brexit. However, this could potentially not be the case. Either way, you can read the data and studies I've pored over and come to your own conclusions if you want. They are in the description or the comments if there are too many sources. This is a very contentious issue for many people. Admittedly, it is a contentious issue for me. EU law has supremacy over British law, meaning that it overrules our law. This results in a common law across Europe in the same way the Holy Roman Empire worked. Now we are going to look into some history now for a couple of minutes, so if you don't wish to listen to this, just skip it. For those who don't know, the Holy Roman Empire was a confederacy of sorts, which began shortly after the fall of Rome and was ultimately destroyed by Napoleon after hundreds of years of decline. It contained the nations shown on this map, and a couple more towards its peak. Essentially, how this political entity worked seems to be similar to the EU. There were laws that ruled over the land decided by imperial diets and imperial courts. Imperial diets were somewhat similar to the EU Parliament, where three classes of states would convene. These were the electors, larger states such as Brandenburg, which had one vote and the capacity to elect an emperor. The second class was for reasonably sized states such as Bavaria, which had one vote. And there was also a third class of the smallest of states, such as Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, which banded together to form one vote. Their decisions were abided by all the various city-states, duchies and kingdoms within the Holy Roman Empire. From there, those entities had de facto rule within their borders. Do you see the similarities? This didn't go too well towards the end. There were numerous wars inside of the Holy Roman Empire, the most famous being the 30 Years' War, which led to some areas of Germany having their population reduced by 2/3. There were also problems with ideologies of states, such as the difference in religion between Austria and Saxony, for instance. I think it's safe to say, though, that many of the issues wouldn't have occurred if the Emperor and those who supported him had not been so stubborn. Now, I'm not saying that this will happen within the EU. I struggle to see a situation with a war on the scale of the 30 Years' War occurring within the EU. However, there could be similar political issues as seen within the Holy Roman Empire. It is important to remember, however, that this union did persist for more than 1,000 years before the march of progress finally destroyed it. Either way, it really seems to depend on how you see British sovereignty. A major argument I have noticed amongst pro-EU people is that we cannot be trusted to rule ourselves. They seem to cite that our political elite are too untrustworthy to really govern us well. However, I ask, what makes you think that they are any different from other countries? Since the creation of the first republics in Rome and Athens, the political elites have seldom had interest in the majority aside from for their own gains. Even generally admired people like Caesar have only used the people to their own ends. The UK Parliament has those people, and so does the European Parliament. Leaving the EU will not change that. I generally would support the abolishment of European Union supremacy of law simply because of the difference in cultures across Europe and the way places work. Setting a law to govern farmers in Spain, for instance, could have a gigantic influence on people in Romania inadvertently. Europe is not the United States. There are massive differences in language by hundreds of miles, let alone culture and ways of doing things. I think it would be foolhardy to try and rule Europe in such a manner that the EU seems to strive to do, as EU supremacy of law seems to be very similar to the relationship between federal and state law in the United States. To conclude on these issues, it seems to be very subjective and very much up in the air whether or not we should leave. On one hand, we gain better control of our borders and the potential to have more profit from handcrafted trade agreements. However, there is also the issue of uncertainty and the potential loss of corporate investment. Regardless, I believe that we should leave the EU since I believe that we have the economic grunt to go it alone, as well as the ability to control our immigration better. I also dislike the amount of anti-Brexit propaganda circulated, which makes me suspicious of what those in power really desire behind the scenes. I, of course, cannot tell what they desire, but I think it is something for people to be aware of. Subscribers, just to let you know, there will be some more tutorials coming out soon. probably for SDL2 and potentially more detail on Jansen and Jason. I will also demo my Vietnam War game in detail as well. As you can probably tell from looking at the footage, it'd be nice if I could have an artist to produce some better art for it. Thanks everyone for watching. Please make your opinions clear in the comments, like and sub if you like this, dislike if you don't. The next video I'll try to do on the topic of politics will be for the remaining GOP candidates.